Good evening. Welcome everybody to Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimo. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies. And on behalf of Casa Italiana, I would like to welcome you all tonight for a very special event. We have a good friend of ours, Alessandro Giardino, who's presenting his recent book published with Rutgers University Press. It's really sort of hot of the press, as we usually say, and we would like to sort of have this event, which is really meant to be a conversation. So I will quickly leave the floor, and we will have three guests. Of course, Alessandro himself, who's gonna talk about his book, and we have two further guests joining. So Alessandro will be in conversation with journalist Annalisa Merelli, and also with Elena Favilli, who's the founder and CEO of Rebel Girls. I won't say much. I haven't read the book yet. I can't wait to read it. I just would like to say that, of course, the title of this book, Caravaggio's Syndrome, is a title which is extremely evocative, not only for people interested in Italian art and history and culture, more specifically for people interested in early modern Italian culture, and I'm one of those people, so I can't wait to hear more about this novel. And it's always interesting to have a scholar who ventures in the sort of, tricky area of fiction, because it's really hard at times to sort of detach from what one is sort of normally dealing with in terms of scholarship. So this will be an interesting, I think, question to raise in our conversation tonight with Alessandro. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alessandro Giardino and our other guests for the presentation of Caravaggio Syndrome.
Thank you.
So actually, I'm here just as the godmother of of the event. So I don't think I should sit down, because I'm here just really to introduce Alessandro very briefly, because he's one of my closest friends, and we go back a long time. We met in when we were young students in Bologna University, and we had just both been awarded with a full scholarship for UC Berkeley. So it was the beginning of our American adventure that somehow put us together, and we became instantly friends, and we've been friends ever since. So it's really a great pleasure and honor for me to be here tonight with him, and to welcome to the world his marvelous book that I know he's been working on for a very long time, and he's been on his mind and thoughts for a long time. And also, in addition to this, since I'm clearly the luckiest person when it comes to friends, I have another friend here tonight, New York-based journalist and author Annalisa Merelli, who will lead the conversation with Alessandro. So there's really nothing for me left to do here, and I'm just gonna leave it to Annalisa Merelli and Alessandro Giardino. Thank you so much, Alessandro.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, surrounded by very close friends and familiar faces. So I will start by taking a hint from what he said, that the Caravaggio Syndrome is a very evocative title. And I read a book in Italian when it came out, and I remember when I heard the title, I was like, yes, of course, so the Caravaggio Syndrome. And then I stopped and was like, no, I don't actually. What is it? So what is it? And I know that there's a passage in the book that sort of first introduces this concept, and maybe we can start by reading that and then discussing a little bit.
Thank you. So thank you, Nalis. We call her Nalis, so her name is Annalisa. And thank you, all of you, for being here. It's such a nice day outside, and just taking your time to listen about Italian literature in translation was a choice. So I appreciate that you coming. So I will start with by reading that passage that you mentioned. We always have hard time. I think it's page 26.
I believe so.
Yes. Yes, and then and before I guess reading the passage, just to give a little bit of context, so the passage that I'm reading are the inner thoughts of one of the three protagonists of the novel. So the novel has a contemporary storyline that intertwines with a 17th century storyline. The 17th century storyline is this travel in time, and you'll get to delve into 17th century Naples. So it's the Naples of Caravaggio that's recounted through the words of the philosopher Tommaso Campanella, who lives between the 16th century and the 17th century, had a very long life. And the contemporary storyline sees these two characters, one of whom is the person we will hear, and she's an art historian. And she's trying to work on this painting, this very, very famous painting that's Caravaggio's 7 Works of Mercy. And she has done her homework. She read any single piece of scholarship, but she feels that scholars have just skimmed the surface of the painting, and she wants to understand more. She feels there's a deeper meaning to the painting. So as she kind of works on the painting, she gives the first definition of the title. Of course, it's always tricky because when you let a character give a definition of the title, you know that's a misleading one, right? It's probably not the one. It's not the only one. It's not the one that you necessarily want a reader to retain. So let's start with hers, and then we'll talk about possible others. Okay, she's called Leyla. Then again, it seemed to Leyla that it was always like this with Caravaggio. Every detail of a painting opened a gateway into another universe. Each protagonist was tangled up in a story that belonged to him or her alone. Until, upon observing them a little longer, the same protagonist began to manifest symptoms of one particular illness, an inner disease that drove them toward the epicenter of the representation, as if toward a black hole. Perhaps that was the fate of the poor woman whom the painter had designated as a Madonna of the people, and perhaps a similar fate had befallen Tommaso Campanella and the many friends gravitating toward him at the time that the seven works came to light. As a matter of fact, on rereading Campanella's book, which she carried everywhere like amulets, Leyla had lingered on the fateful year 1607, in which Caravaggio, already sentenced to death, had been received in Naples by the same young man that Campanella was secretly teaching from his prison. She recalled that the word syndrome in Greek meant convergence, and so she wondered if, besides poring over texts and iconographies, she should try to reassemble the fragments that had made up the scene, describing the manner of their convergence and whether, instead of technique and connotation, it wasn't simply better to just call it what it was, a syndrome, a Caravaggio syndrome. So she gives the first definition, and it's almost like what she sees in the painting, an operational dynamic. She sees a recurring trait in Caravaggio's painting. That's, of course, the layering of different historical times and the kind of like gravitating force at the center of the painting that kind of acts as a black hole. But then, over time, there are many other definitions of Caravaggio syndrome that the reader might intuit. Like, first of all, of course, all those characters share something with Caravaggio. There are aching souls, there are wandering souls, and they seem, in Italian, of course, many of you either speak Italian or read Italian. They're like anime in pain, I will say in Italian, right? So there's certain definition of somebody who constantly has to relocate, and so they share that. there is a technical definition of the Caravaggio Syndrome for art historians that has to do with the copyist and with the art historian claiming everything being a Caravaggio. And well, we've seen in recent years, like paintings and rediscoveries. And so there are many others. But you'll see that, well, for those of you that will get to read the book, that I tried to recreate through words Caravaggio's word, not just by describing it, but creating the same kind of gravitational forces that you see in the painting in the novel, creating that layering of different historical times that you see in Caravaggio's paintings. Caravaggio, when you see Caravaggio's characters, and some of you might know better than others, they're dressed as characters from different historical periods, right? And so you see that overlapping of different times, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want to say too much.
There's also another theme, I think, that maybe is a little bit of another form of Syndrome di Caravaggio, which is sort of like Leyla's sort of daunted relationship with Caravaggio, and like the idea that like she's constantly exposed to this master, this genius, and like an enormity of talent that she can't even match, and in fact sometimes seems like she can't even quite comprehend. I was wondering like what that element, like how that element too sort of like played into the story, and especially like as you as well sort of confronting yourself with at least two very important historical figures and trying to create your own piece of art.
Yes. So by the way, those questions are not prepared. So every time she asks a question, I have to think a little bit about the answer. And sometimes with questions, you always then go somewhere else. But I think I don't feel like it's interesting also because readers make you discover things about the book. As I wrote the book, I never felt that she had an inferiority complex. She never felt, she was more frustrated by the fact that she was now able to really understand some of the deeper layer of the painting. And also because it's a novel, so that I could see how she was, she spent extensive period of time working on several paintings by Caravaggio, and there were moments where they would become mirror to think about her own life. So there were moments where she was approaching them more as scholars, and moments where they become almost reflection pieces, right? And so especially with the Seven Works of Mercy, there is that scene that is troubling to her because in the painting you have Caravaggio introduces a famous Roman trope, caritas. So you see that that woman who is breastfeeding an old person, and so that's but a reference to Caritas, to the Roman legend of Cimone Pero. There's like a Latin story, but at the same time, it's also a scene from the street of Naples at the time, maybe of a prostitute who had lost her child, and this man was in jail and was poor, and so she does something that may be very disturbing to the viewer, like as she's a young woman breastfeeding an older man who is in jail, right? So she herself, through her pregnancy, there are memories from her past that are resurfacing. She also used that painting triggers something into her. So at the same time, she works on the painting as a scholar, so she tries to understand, the meaning of the painting in its context. And at the same time, she cannot help herself but being stuck in many ways, emotionally and intellectually, right? So that's so more than intimidated, she is probably constantly puzzled by it, right? So I guess that's probably what it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When in her definition of the syndrome or the syndrome, there is the concept of convergence, which to me makes me think immediately of the Seven Works of Mercy, because that's kind of where everything, like all the threads of the book, work in. And I think there's an element to it, which is like the work itself is actually real life related to the thinking of Campanella. Can you talk about that a little bit more and explain and like introduce a little more of the character of Campanella and the role he had in your,
yes,
academic pursuit?
So Campanella, Tommaso Campanella. So once again, better known by, of course, Italian scholars, a little less by foreigners. Campanella. my only problem is to be concise, right? So try to so Campanella is a revolutionary hero. In some other presentation that I gave in Italy, because I did a little bit book tour in Italy, this is the translated version. Very often people said, "Oh, it's just like Gramsci," and he was in many ways, because from he lived like about 27 years in prison. He was moved to different castles, then liberated, end up in prison again. And so from this prison, it became a kind of beacon of light for a network of European philosophers, astrologers, scientists that were trying to, they were making what we will then call, the early modern period, the scientific method, et cetera, et cetera. So from the jail, he was in correspondence with this large network of intellectuals, and what I like, what really captivated me, of course, is that differently from Giordano Bruno, Campanella was never survived. He wasn't burned at the stake because while he never recanted his ideas, every time, and some people know that, every time he was about to maybe be executed, he pretended to be crazy, to be mad, and according, of course, you could not execute somebody who could not repent for the religion of the time. So he decided to survive, but he didn't decide to survive because he was afraid to die. He decided to survive because he felt that he was afraid his ideas would not survive if he died, and because he lived, experienced torture, very difficult condition of living. So became such an hero, especially at the time I was completing the novel during COVID or just editing it and thinking, how much cowardice we all share in not expressing our ideas, whatever our ideas were, right? And somebody at a different time having the courage to experience torture and almost 40 years of jail to stick to to whatever he felt it was correct and right? So that was one reason. I also met what at one point I believe to be the greatest Campanella scholar. She was a woman, Germana Ernst. She read the article, there was a scholarly article on the 7 Works of Mercy where I basically proved how Campanella's theories had an impact on the circle of commissioners of the painting, because Caravaggio was very much dependent on the commissioners in his iconology, different from Michelangelo. It was, it was less it was educated, but for instance, Caravaggio, there's nothing that he left written, so it was very dependent on the commissioners. So once I wrote that article, then I asked Germana Ernst, as she was the greatest scholar of Campanella, to read the scholarly article, and she agreed. And of course, she said that it was very likely, and she died a few weeks after. But Germana Ernst, in many ways, as there's in Leyla, there's something of her, because Leyla represents all those women, I guess, that became professors or that accessed academia in the 50s, and they had to make their way with great sacrifices, right? And then there was no doubt that she was well above her male peers, but for her, of course, it was never an issue about being a woman. She was very devoted. She discovered most of the papers in archives. They're connected to Campanella. So it was both a tribute to Campanella and to her, I guess. Yeah.
And let's maybe talk a little bit more about, we talk a little bit about her work and her pursuit, but also we find her in the beginning of the novel, at a very particular time in her life. Can we do a little spoiler? I think it's the very beginning. She accidentally gets pregnant, has a child. That's sort of the beginning of the whole interaction. And I was curious as to how, what made you think of her that way, and how did you design then her journey through space, I would say, but also through
as a pregnant woman.
Exactly, as myself.
what's the question again?
The question is how, why did you pick this moment for her, and and then how did you follow her? Because then it sort of doesn't become maternity doesn't really become what defines her, I would say.
Right.
Which is instead a trope that we find.
Yeah, that's a good question. I love to be surprised by questions because it's really helped me think through. So first, as a scholar, she is very much, and as many people, or as writers, her books are children very often, right? So I like the idea that she is, let's say, without spoiling too much. Also, she decides, of course, eventually to call her son Tommaso, and then she's very much in the present moment and somewhere else, because as most scholars, most of her mental energy is allocated to a different time period, right? So that's where she lives most of the time. She lives in 17th century Naples because that's what she's studying, right? So I like that. I like this kind of twofold idea of pregnancy. I also like that she is, and that was very important for me actually, for all those characters. There are many reasons why a person writes a novel, and this specifically for me, there are many reasons. In a way, it was simply an exercise in language. I wanted to see if after living abroad for 15 years, I wrote in Italian, I could still write in Italian at a literary level first. But among the many reasons, there was also a certain annoyance at a style of literature that has become politically engaged or that has overlapped with identity politics. What I always like about literature is that characters don't have to define themselves one way or another. And so as I develop these characters, she is constantly surprised by whatever happens to her. She's surprised by this trauma that are resurfacing, because of her pregnancy and because of the painting. She's trying to understand, to determine the relationship she had with her father, and she always questions her memories as well. Is this her own narrative, or this real memories? So she's also surprised that she wants to be pregnant in the first place, because for a very long time that was not even a desire for her. So I like that she constantly surprises herself, and she constantly questions herself, and she doesn't hold any truth. And to me, that's what I always felt was the beauty of literature, that there's not a message that I'm trying to pass, right? That the characters are complex, and many people in Italian say, "Oh, Leyla è antipatica." No? She's not a sympathetic character, but in many ways she is, because she's not, right? So.
I have a couple of questions specifically about the craft. As you said, also there was an element of stylistic exercise. One is, as you mentioned, there's that sort of Caravaggio attempt of having multidimensional elements in a story, or storytelling, which you do jumping backward and forward in time, but also there's an interesting bending where Tommaso Campanella dreams of the future, and he dreams of Leyla in the future. So it's not just the classic juxtaposition. And I was curious how much of that was from the very beginning in the planning of the novel, and how much of that sort of emerged itself as you were telling the story.
That's a good question, because it wasn't at the beginning. I felt I want. So there are many ways in which Campanella. So they were certainly connected to him, because they're reading this fictional journal that I created. And once again, 90% of what I say about his life in this fictional journal is actually historically accurate. I would say there's 5-10% of creation, and one are these dreams that he has, and so I want him to also be able to connect with them, and so this connection to be a two-way street in many ways, but also it would make total sense, because Campanella was somebody who would have dreams and hallucination and have angels visiting him. So it was the kind of characters that they could have those dreams, right? I introduced at one point, and as I introduce it, I love it, because then you would think the Campanella was in many ways. I wanted Campanella to be more present than the present. So at first, of course, it was a narrative strategy because Campanella writes his fictional journal as in the first person that makes it closer to us, whereas the contemporary storyline is told in the third person that creates a distance. So he was already closer to us, but then feeling that he would be able to connect with us, with the other two protagonists in a different way, was a way for them to really create like a family.
Mm-hmm. Should we read one of the passages where he dreams of Leyla?
Oh yeah, remind me
115.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. All right. So this is one of his dreams, of Campanella's dream. Last night, I dreamed again of Leyla, or I should say the mother. This woman of wood, in another millennium, far from the shores, will have the strength, the stubbornness, and the impudence to bring me once again into this world. Have seen her forced into a life of flight, of constant exile, if for no other outcome than the one generated in her womb out of my fluid. And yet, as far as I can tell, hers will be the flight of a woman besieged by herself. So I don't know how long you, because...
I actually will stop there because my
Yeah.
following question was about her travel and like the fact that we have these characters that you say like anime and pena, but even geographically they move quite a lot and they choose very specific locations. So there's New York, there's Paris, there's Naples. These are all very charged places. And why, out of all of them, the one that surprised me for some reason was New York, because so like Naples and Paris, they make sense in the original, at least the ancient story. But why New York?
Yes. So actually, this is the first time I read this passage, and I was reading it now. I will immediately answer you, but something that's connected to your question is, I just realized, so very difficult in literature to introduce Campanella philosophical concept, but one of those was that the child as a fluid would influence the behavior of the mother, right? And so that answers your question, because him being an aching soul, it would make sense that she, in a different century, would be also, an aching soul and a wanderer, right? And a traveler, always escaping either a situation or some inner drives. I like the idea of connecting the old continent, the new continent, and Campanella was very much interested, of course, in the Maya culture and in the new, let's say this, in the Americas, right? So he had, his mind was many of his writing, even the City of the Sun, as you know, is very much, was some of you know, was very much inspired by South American or Central American culture, right, and the model of society. So, so he was projected towards that world. The other two cities are, of course, Naples and Paris. So the story unfolds between. So it starts as a campus novel, and then the three characters leave, and then at a different moment in time. Of course, Campanella is never in New York, but the other two characters are between New York, Paris, and Naples. But Campanella actually lived in Paris, and well, in Naples mostly, before. There's a moment when he lived in Naples. He came from Calabria. He became famous in Naples, and then he lived most of his life in a prison in Naples. But then he had a second life in Paris. As I say, a very long life for his time. And so when he finally decided that he had to leave Italy because there was the risk he would be jailed again, he became almost a curiosity at the court of Louis XIV, because his ideas, by the time he had been freed, had become common knowledge. So he had been tortured in jail for almost 40 years for ideas that then would become so passé that when it was at the court of Louis XIV, it was the old passé and maybe better developed. It was life of freedom, but from Paris, he was able to then publish most of the writings. He had been written in jail before, right?
I feel like we've been talking about the fact that there's 3 characters, but we've only been talking about 2 so far.
True.
So should we introduce the third?
Michael. Okay.
And I'm quite pleased that the contemporary guy comes in last.
Yeah. So I think what we can do, I like it for Michael. So Michael is the young student who becomes almost a research assistant for Leyla. Is also, if you want, the fresher character if you like to use this terminology, is a LGBTQ character. Is a guy that once again is trying to discover himself, and then both emotionally and sexually. And he give sort of probably freshness to the novel itself. So maybe I'm gonna read the first pages of Michael, and then some things that I read in the past is always very hard because all those characters then meet the painting at one point. I think the one that is a little bit more clear in this kind of talk is when Michael meets the painting. So I may probably read both. But these passages are always a little bit long, so I'll try to read as, there was some other readings where we had a reader, a person who says, I love her. I was like, she's so good.
So nice.
I would say that. So, Michael, okay. So let's introduce.
I know that I know that he meets the painting at page 140, but
okay.
The original introduction.
Well, it's the first time, we'll just see the first time that it appears. And then that's Michael. We're gonna.
Sorry, I've got all my references on the Italian books. I'm trying to match it up.
Let's see. Oh, maybe. Okay, I got it. Okay, yes, Michael. Page 37. Okay. Saranac Lake, New York, May 2006. His mother had decided on the name, inspired by an old catalog of Michelangelo's David, which had been left in the house by his grandfather, along with some other odds and ends. That his grandfather had died was part of the order of things. That he, Michael, was still alive was pure chance. Having been abandoned as a child by his father with no qualms, he had grown up like a cactus plant, kept alive by sporadic watering and plenty of natural light. He was thin, wiry, hairless, and even emaciated when he had to skip a meal or two. He knew the fleshier and naughtier girls were attracted to him much the same way as men over 50 were. However, he never experienced enduring romantic of sexual passions, and in the rare moment of yielding to an erection, he stood alone, closing his eyes and visualizing white and shapeless shadows. That morning, he had woken up at dawn, realized that the milk had expired days ago, and that the cereal at the bottom of the box would barely fill a small cup of coffee. So he settled on eating the flakes one at a time, picking them out of the box, and while Lucius the cat sat in his lap, he absent-mindedly drafted a list of things to do. He wanted to repair his fixed-gear bike, pass by the florist, buy a garlic rose to plant in the garden, cut his nails with small scissors to avoid the slice effect of nail clippers. His mother constantly repeated, "Either you start to plan your future now, or you'll end up like your father." And every time she made this pronouncement, what came to mind was the scene when his father, coming home after one of his benders, bent over him, his shirt open, his chest sweaty, his breath disgusting. He had just turned 9. Today, despite being convinced there was nothing like his lacquer of a father, Michael had to admit that his mother's fears were not baseless. He had finished high school with a decent average. He knew how to write better than most of his friends, but he had no desire whatsoever to study for competitive admission tests. Besides which, even though even though he was not an Olympic rower, he hoped he could join a rowing team and perhaps secure a scholarship to a college not too far from home. True, every now and then, he did think about the universities in large cities, but he never imagined to imagine a life far from his cat, far from the shores of the lake, or from the peace and quiet that found at home after his father left. St. Luke University was a few minutes away. Maddie, a childhood friend of his, spoke about it enthusiastically every time she visited him. It seemed to be the easiest choice, and all things considered, the most reasonable. All of a sudden, he sprang out of his chair, and while Lucius rolled around on the ground, he undressed, gazed for a second in the mirror, felt pleased with his image from head to toe. Then, with a slightly foolish grin on his face, he headed toward the shower. From the other side of the house, his mother, who had just woken up, loudly called to him, "Michael, are you still here?" "Always, Mom, always," he answered, like Narcissus to his echo. However, the words hovered like a dialogue between two deaf people. And so that's like Michael. So we gave,
We like
since we didn't talk about him.
we gave him a whole big description. I have a question, which is, how is it for you to read your own words translated into English out loud? Like, and what's the difference between even just the feeling of having the Italian version and the English version?
Well, first of all, as everybody knows, it's always different to read out loud and to read in your mind as you write. Sometimes, as I read out loud, both in Italian and English, I cut some of the sentences, right? Because in your mind, they can just be longer. But the translation was a very interesting process. We did back and forth with the main translator. I collaborated with her quite a bit, and for me the rhythm of the sentence was really important. So that's why she first when she started working on the novel, I asked her that I said, like, I want this to be pleasant for an English-speaking reader, and at the same time I want the reader to hear the Italian that's behind the text, because that's what I like when I write foreign writers, that I can recognize the culture and the language behind the English. But this was a very difficult balance, and I think she was too diligent to the task, so I had to kind of go back and say, well, I still want this to be pleasant and to sound right in English, right? So I had to rework on it, and of course the impossible task was to find an English dictionary for Tommaso Campanella, because in the Italian version I had, of course, his writing and I had his letters and his poetry. So in crafting this fictional journal, I could rely on that, and even for the Italian, eventually I decided to be slightly less philologically accurate to make the reading experience a little bit more pleasant. But then for the English version, we had to find a similar balance. So it was, it's interesting, but by reading it in English, then also it's like when the reader reads it, you also rediscover it. You rediscover things, you forgot things, and you rediscover your own book, and you start working on it. It's a very long but interesting and to a certain extent satisfying, to a certain extent very frustrating process. Yes.
You had said that when you wrote the book in Italian, you deliberately tried to stay away from sort of the more concise style that's very in vogue, you said. And I think Italian as a language lends itself more than English to this kind of pursuit. Right. Was that something that you tried to preserve in the English book? And do you think that will be even more jarring, maybe perhaps more jarring to English readers than it will be to Italians?
Yes, so I certainly tried to keep it. As I said, eventually, like the translator was very diligent to the task. Eventually, I decided certain things. I like what I like, I mean, even when I actually teach my students how to write, even a scholarly essay, I say like a scholarly essay and literature even more is like music, right? It's like there must be a rhythm. It's like 3-3-1, 3-3-1. So sentences like write like 3 sentences, then write like a short sentence, a one-liner, then write 3 sentences. So there must be that balance that makes the reading experience enjoyable. And so I try to preserve that in English. English literature from the past has those long sentences too, and I think Italian have been resisting a little bit more, although contemporary Italians haven't. And I think there's something about that musicality that I enjoy when, very often, I pick a book at the bookstore, a new writer, the story seems compelling, but there's no rhythm, and it's not, you can appreciate books for different reasons, but that's something that since I seek in a novel, I try to reproduce for a reader that has a similar taste. Of course, you write for others, but to a certain extent, you also write for yourself because that's what you know and that's what you like. Right? So, yeah.
There was something that you said earlier when you were talking about finding the English language for like the English actual vocabulary for Campanella, that sort of like we had a glimpse, I thought, about in the mind of a scholar who tries to then, or like who writes fiction and that tension. And I was curious a little bit more about what the work itself was was like, if it was difficult, if it actually was liberating, like what was the sort of dealing with making up things, really, which is what scholars never do.
Oh yeah, I love to make up things. What I like to, one of the reasons of the novel was that so in the research and my scholarly research, I had proven the influence of Campanella's thoughts and theories on Caravaggio's painting. It's a known fact they were in Naples at the same time. They knew the same people because the commissioners of the painting were the one visiting Campanella in jails, and at moment of relaxation even taking classes with Campanella from the jail. So he was teaching people from the jail, but there's no proof of an encounter, a meeting between the artist and the philosopher, right? So sure, common friends or acquaintances, same cities, similar ideas. So what the fiction allows is for them to meet, right? So then there was, and that's fictional, although it's not entirely unlikely. And it allows also, and that was a little difficult with Campanella because on the one hand, his life is heroic. His writings are the writings of a 17th century person. So they're not always and very much interested in very often philosophical issues that to us have no relevance whatsoever, right? So to make it also a little bit more humane, and his poetry is humane, actually, the one that he writes from jail, and to have him, both speak about big philosophical system, but also describing how he could have experienced his daily life. I think, and that was one of the goals, that allowed me to make it a little bit more accessible and to bring it back. Once again, for Italians, it's also interesting. It's actually in that this book will not land exactly the same way for an Italian audience and for a foreign audience because the references are different, right? So I also had that in mind. And so when I was describing or more than narrating, more than describing the reality of a campus, I had in mind what an Italian reader might know, and without being too didascalic, I was dropping things here and there for people to understand that reality a little bit better. And I did the same thing for 17th century Italy, that I guess an Italian reader, some Italian readers at least, might know a little bit better, but a foreign reader might not know at all, right? So how do you make that accessible without completely, create a parody of that time period. So yeah.
So I guess the process of translation started before you even like in the Italian book itself, there is an element of like cultural, like you were already thinking about it.
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting question, because like first I say, oh, I'm going to write this in English, and I say, oh, no, I'm going to write it in Italian, and it would have been challenging in both languages. And then, but I completed, the two processes kind of started. I started a little bit at the same time, but then, I mean, yes, we work on the English translation once the Italian. But yeah, there was something that was present to my mind that, yes, I would have liked, because I live between the two worlds, right, that I wanted that to be accessible to both an Italian-speaking readership and Italian-speaking, and English-speaking readership as well. Yeah.
So I would say before we open to questions, I'd like to close by reading the encounter with the 7 Words of Mercy, because it seems like a good convergence just to go back to the original.
And one thing that I've not done in previous, because for those of you who know the painting or have the book, there is an image. But I would say, even like if you wish, take like as I look for the page, take 2 seconds. I don't know if there's, like if you can get on your phone the painting, the 7 Works of Mercy, as I read, there is an image in the book. It's going to be easier for you. So if you don't know the painting, like on your phone, look Caravaggio, like the title.
It's over here.
7 Works of Mercy. Oh, the Italian version, yeah.
Yes, it's the cover of the Italian version.
Yeah. So this is the. This is when Michael.
You can pass it around, actually. So
this
long
is,
as it
yeah.
gets back to me.
This is an excerpt of this larger painting. But once again, if you have phone, like just Google Caravaggio 7 Works of Mercy. And otherwise, you'll close your eyes and you'll try to visualize it through the words. Okay. So he has arrived at the chapel where he sees the painting. This is Michael. So once inside, the painting appeared before him like an ancient mastodon, high and mighty and seemingly displeased for having been made to wait so long. It was almost impossible, because of the reflection on the varnish and the dark entry points, to get a unified vision of the work. Driven to look from the bottom of the canvas, Michael began to gaze at the image of Pore, the woman nourishing her chained and imprisoned father, and noticed, maybe for the first time, the small crown of fabric that she was wearing like a silver of the moon. From her breast, spilling forth somehow vulgarly, he passed on the scene behind, where a toothless man in shirt and beret wielded a long torch and accompanied a funeral procession with shouts and prayers. A corpse was fit where the only body part visible was wrapped and dragged in a sheet. He had been readily pushed off a bed, who knows whether to ward off pestilential emanations or to erase the traces of a carnal crime. In the upper part of the painting, the Virgin of Mercy, or the Nursing Madonna, neither Ear nor Leyla had been able to reach a definite conclusion, floated above the circle of thrilling angels, and beneath them, and here, Michael was obliged to come and go continuously to focus on the image beyond the clash of colors and improvise commotion. Samson, with a bone remnant used as a water flask, an innkeeper with rotund and ruddy pointed to the closest lodgings, and on the ground, one of the many desperate vagrants whom a local squire would rescue and exploit, proving that nothing much had changed since Caravaggio's time. He remembered having discussed the astrological beliefs of those years and the possible juxtaposition between the Virgin and the celestial Venus with Leyla. It was only in front of the painting, however, that he wondered if the 7 works could not represent the 7 days of the week, or the house of the sun and the planets gravitating around it. He observed that the warrior saint, Saint Martin, that is Mars, obscured another figure which could easily function as Mercury, with special headgear often associated with the celestial messenger, But when squinting, he wondered about the sneaky attitude, about the brim fallen down his face. He seemed like a fugitive. And so Michael asked himself, why did Caravaggio and Campanella flee? Why was everyone running away? He himself was running away. Leyla had run away. Those who ran away were maybe the ones who felt the world was squeezing them too tightly, was crushing them. What pain, what inner agitation, what turmoil was responsible? He surmised, it is nothing but a question of weight. One weight after another, a collapse, impossible to foresee, to predict, even with a second of its occurrence, unstoppable. And along with this collapse, a fusion with the world, with the weight of the cosmos, the reverberation of other explosions, in that precise instant, but light years away.
Any questions?
Questions?
Thank you. I have two. Well, first of all, thank you, Professor Giardino, for this marvelous presentation. It's such a treat, so enlightening. The questions are, the moment I saw on my computer the email from Casa saying Caravaggio Syndrome, that very instant I reserved a place because there's just something ever so riveting in, the combination of the two words, syndrome. And I'm still not sure I quite understand, after your superb presentation, how syndrome, I don't know if you can, in one or two sentences, sort of summarize, the choice of this particular term for the title of the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question. So on the one hand, as I said, I also wanted the reader to come up with their own interpretation of the title, and here and there, I drop hints. What I can say, so you said like I saw Caravaggio, hit me. I hope the reader will experience the book in many ways how they would experience a Caravaggio painting, meaning there will be moment of the sublime, a moment of the grotesque. I really like that oscillation that's very Baroque. And so the book is a Baroque book in many ways because of this combination of those two words, because of a style of writing that has that oscillation between the sublime and the Baroque. And there's an element of perversion or disease to book, not because the characters are perverted, but because there's a disease, there's a condition that they experience that they have a hard time defining, and that in many ways connects them to Caravaggio, right? So there is, as I said, there's the element of convergence too, but I don't want to kind of give the two-line definition because that's exactly the point, as I said, of my book. It's not a book with a message. It is an open book that it wants to lead itself to interpretation, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. The second one is an absolutely stunning cover of the English translation.
Uh-huh.
I mean, a magnificent one.
Yes, I agree.
I liked it much better than the Italian one. What made you pick this particular excerpt of a painting for the cover?
That's a good question. The cover. So this is like a picture by Luciano Romano, who was very gracious in gifting me this image for free, actually. Generous, really. And then this was part of an exhibition that actually was installed at the chapel where the painting stands since 1607. So at Piemonte la Misericordia, that's the chapel in Naples. And this artist, of course, was very much inspired by Caravaggio, by 1600, like 17th century painting in general. And what I like is that, so he's a contemporary photographer that is very much inspired by that aesthetic, right? Since the book, it seemed like the perfect image for a number of reasons. Because the book, as I said, it alternates between this contemporary storyline and the 17th century storyline. So the picture captivated, those two words, because the book creates that connection to a word that's of otherness and it's spiritual, if you want, and something that it's very earthly and it's very physical, and so that I think that the picture captured that element too. There is a strong female voice. The book, the first character, the first lines that I wrote are the lines about Leyla. So when you read the first passage about Leyla, in that way I was very much inspired by modernist writer like Virginia Woolf, or I wrote for a long time on Bassani, where the first lines of a book really captivate the personality of this figure, right? And so I start with that. So the female presence, the female voice is a very strong presence in the book. And so there are many other reasons, but these are some of those. And I agree, I love that. I love this cover too. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Any other questions? There's a mic.
Yeah, the mic goes
around.
Where's oh.
Hi, it's more a comment than a question. I was lucky enough just to come across the recent Paris Review interview with Anne Carson, and maybe you've read it too.
I haven't read it,
But in terms of this translation, she's asked about that space of translation, and she said, well, even writing your own book in your own language is translation. And she said it's like being in a ditch. So I wanted to just kind of share that. And also she's kind of praising the place of contradiction, which is so important.
Yeah.
To not know exactly where you are. And that's where the looseness comes in, and she says you have a new landscape then.
Yeah.
So I wonder how that sits with you.
I mean, for us, for some, I as those who know me, so I at home I speak French. I'm Italian, of course. I teach in English, and so of course it's it's even more of a ditch.
All the time, yeah.
You really have to dig yourself out of the ditch constantly.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful exercise, and it's a constant discovery of equivalences, so slight differences, as we all know, and then it's that's why it's frustrating, but it's also satisfying. It's because every moment you get yourself out of the ditch is like a ha-ha moment.
Yeah.
You can,
You have to be at attention,
Right.
which is one of her moments.
Yeah.
Yes, what is your opinion of the old Italian saying, traduttore, traditore?
Oh, yeah, this is like a translator, trader. In Italian, it sounds better. Yeah, sure. I mean, I have no problem betraying myself. And actually, in the translation, I decided, to be honest, because it was my novel, and I was working with a translator, there are a few lines that I cut. I decided that in English they would not make sense, they were not useful. So there have been a couple of times where I said, well, it's a different book. So there were moments where for me it was very important to be close to the text, and some others, very, very few instances, where I said, well, that expression, some metaphors that don't make sense, So I was able to cut it, and yeah, I mean it's yeah, I don't believe. I think people that, as I said, like this idea of like truth is a very moralist idea. This idea of like loyalty, it's hypocritical or just deluded in many ways. So I think you just want to write a book that people can read and have an interesting experience and emotional experience and intellectual experience. And so yeah, so that's so I don't have a problem with betraying. Yeah.
Alessandro, I'm curious to hear what you think that this book represents for your career in terms of, you know, it's a very academic book in many ways. I mean, you talk about Campanella, you talk about Caravaggio, and their fictional meeting, the fictional encounter. So there is that, but then of course there is the art of the writer. And of course, there is an illustrious tradition of authors that were scholars that became authors, and they kept those two career paths going. So I would be curious to hear: is this a one-off, or is this going to be the beginning of something? And how then would you situate the book, this particular book? In your career path, because you're more than just the author here. You're the translator, and so you're present in many different ways, in many different functions.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Well, the problem is I cannot go back to what I was doing before. Now I can only, and as long as my university allow me to do it, I will do it. I'm lucky because, well, I actually allow myself to do it before tenure, but I was still publishing, the kind of like scholarly work that was requested. But I think it's such a, I'm a little like people who are in academia. Since academia has become this publisher of perish word, then you're always there kind of like writing something that has to be published. And very often I'm a little uncomfortable with having to argue something. As I said, I have a very difficult relationship with this sense of truth, that I know the truth, I'm going to argue this now, right? So I think what literature allows you to do is to conduct research in a different way. That's much more interesting to me, because what really interests me is to be there, and so to recreate this world. What were they eating? How were they living? What were they wearing? And everything and every element of the research is useful, can be used. Whereas very often in scholarly research, you read all those articles that you're basically not going to use because, and so it's very satisfactory as a research process. It allows me to use research in a different way, and at the same time, writing for me, as I say, was. It started also as an exercise with Italian, like can I write at that level, but also became it's better than yoga, of course, because at the moment, while you write, you're fully immersed. Is a mindfulness experience, and something that probably some of you may know, but just very two people. I don't even know if you know, maybe Elena knows, is that I started my career, I used to be, I was in theater for many, many years, in 10 years, and then I decided to do something else. But the way I write is very much inspired by the experience of acting, meaning for me, acting was like I research the characters and then I can improvise. And so to channel the voice of those characters, the kind of research was for me to be able for them to have a voice, and so that's also a very satisfactory experience to give these characters a voice. That it's their voice, but it's also channeled through me, right? So that's so there's always a little bit of me, but I try to be as as for them. I think if I thought that I'm not there, that would be lying to myself. But I really try for them to have their own voice. Yes. So I think I want to thank you, all of you, for being here. I also want to thank the publisher who sent somebody who can they will have the book upstairs, and then that's very nice on especially on a Monday. There's like a Passover for some, and then and all of you for coming. And I encourage you to write me even if you didn't like the book, because especially if I have to write another one, feedback is always useful. And I really never take it, personal. I take it for what it is, and I always reflect upon it. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.